The Hooper breakfast room had always been Madison's theatre. That morning it became her courtroom. Olivia took her usual chair, the one nearest the window where the light should have been generous, but even the sun seemed uncertain of her now, falling instead across Madison's copper hair like a crown no one had formally awarded her. She was not eating. She was performing stillness, the way a blade performs stillness before it moves. She did not raise her voice. Madison never raised her voice when she meant to wound. "You've stolen the light, Olivia." She turned her teacup with one deliberate finger. "But remember, shadows always return to kill the sun." At the head of the table, Mrs. Hooper had already unfolded yesterday's society pages and was annotating them in pencil, columns of names crossed out and circled with the efficiency of a general reassigning troops after an unexpected defeat. She had not looked up. She did not need to. Her silence was its own set of orders. Their brother Thomas kept his eyes on his plate, moving a piece of toast he would not eat. A good soldier, their mother had always made sure of that. Olivia knew the shape of this moment. She had lived inside it her whole life, the slow collective pressure of a room willing her to disappear. Her hands wanted to fold, her spine wanted to curve. Then her fingers found the corner of the sealed letter in her pocket. Not the Duke's signet ring, something quieter, more permanent. A letter from Arundel's land steward, addressed not to the Duke, but to her, requesting her counsel on the failing northern fields. She looked at Madison, not the way she usually looked at her, not through the gauze of old defeat. She looked at her the way she looked at a ledger that did not balance, with patience and with the absolute certainty that she would find the error. The Duke had given her one dance, but the steward had given her something Madison could not perform her way into, charm her way past, or steal with a whisper. He had given her a problem to solve, and Olivia Hooper had never, in her life, failed to solve one. The breakfast things had not yet been cleared when Mrs. Hooper spoke. "Close the door, Olivia." It was not a request, it never was. Madison had already excused herself, floated out, rather, trailing the faint scent of rose-water and satisfaction, and Thomas had been dispatched on some errand that would conveniently keep him occupied until lunch. The room, which had felt crowded with tension minutes before, now felt emptier and more dangerous for it. Rooms with fewer witnesses always did. Olivia closed the door. Her mother did not look up immediately. She was still seated at the head of the table, the society pages set aside now, replaced by something altogether less decorative. A leather ledger, dark and swollen at the spine, the kind that did not belong in a breakfast room, the kind that belonged in a solicitor's office or a debtor's court. "Sit." Olivia sat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, the letter from Arundel still tucked against her ribs like a secret heartbeat. Mrs. Hooper opened the ledger to a page near the back, not the first marked page, Olivia noted, not even the second. She had been here before, had turned to this reckoning privately, many times. She turned it now and pushed it across the white linen without a word. Olivia looked down. The numbers were not a surprise in their existence. They were a surprise only in their scale. She did not speak. She ran her eye down the column of figures the way her father had taught her, the father no one mentioned any more, tallying, cross-referencing, reading the story that numbers told more honestly than people ever did. Creditors she recognized, the Mayfair dressmaker, the wine merchant, the lease on the town house itself. Creditors she didn't, names that suggested loans taken quietly in the kind of offices that did not advertise their services in the broadsheets. "How long?" Olivia said. 3 years. Mrs. Hooper's voice was perfectly level. Catastrophe, in her mother's register, sounded identical to conversation. "Your father's investments were less sound than he led us to believe. I have managed it, juggled it, but juggling requires an ever-increasing number of hands, and I find myself running short." And Madison knows? Madison knows what she needs to know, which meant no, which meant Olivia, as always, was to be the repository of uncomfortable truths, while Madison remained pristine and unburdened, a perfect surface that reflected only what was useful. She looked back at the ledger. "What is it you want me to do?"
Mrs. Hooper retrieved the book, closed it with a soft and final sound, and set it beside her teacup, as though it were nothing more alarming than a novel she had finished. "The Duke of Arundel," she said, "is one of the wealthiest men in England. He is also, by all accounts, a man who does not spend carelessly. He does not gamble. He does not keep expensive habits. What he does keep is a large and apparently troubled estate, a staff of men who cannot seem to solve his land problems, and," she paused, the pause doing its work, "a very recent and very public interest in you." "His interest," Olivia said carefully, "is practical. He has written to ask my opinion on a failing harvest rotation in his northern fields." "Yes," Mrs. Hooper smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had already decided how a game would end. "You will go, and you will be useful, and while you are being useful, you will also be attentive to his accounts, to his losses, to the places where a well-timed loan, from a wife's family, arranged discreetly before the wedding, of course, might be presented as generosity rather than necessity." The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart moved slowly down the Mayfair street. A sparrow made some small commotion in the window box. Ordinary sounds moving through a morning that had become something else entirely. "You want me to assess his finances," Olivia said, "and position our family as his solution before he has decided I am his future." "I want you," her mother said with great patience, "to be practical. You are a clever girl. You have always been a clever girl. I am simply asking you to be clever in a direction that benefits this family." Olivia looked at the closed ledger. She looked at her mother's hands, still and certain on the tablecloth. She looked at the window, where the light had finally decided to arrive, falling across the floor in long, honest lines. She thought of the letter at her ribs, the steward's handwriting, plain and direct. "Your assessment of the drainage issue, Miss Hooper, was the most cogent I have received in 6 years of correspondence." "I will go to Arundel," she said, rising from her chair, her voice quiet and even and entirely her own. "I will do what I do. I will fix what can be fixed." She did not add the rest. She did not say, "And I will not be your instrument, Mother." She didn't need to say it. She only needed to make it true. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, in Mayfair, the worst possible day for a scandal. Mondays were forgivable. The Ton was still recovering from the weekend's entertainments and had not yet fully assembled its apparatus of judgment. Wednesdays belonged to the lending libraries and the afternoon calls, where gossip moved at a leisurely pace and lost heat in the retelling. But Tuesday was the day the morning rooms filled early, when visiting cards were exchanged with the precision of chess pieces, and information traveled faster than any post-horse. It was a Tuesday, therefore, that Elliot Hunter, the Duke of Arundel, sent his private courier to the Hooper townhouse on Grosvenor Street, not with a note for Mrs. Hooper, not with flowers for Madison, but with a formally sealed letter, pressed with his ducal crest, addressed in his own hand to Miss Olivia Hooper. The courier made no effort to be discreet. He had not been instructed to. Olivia was in the small upstairs study, the room no one else used because it faced north and received no flattering light, when the housekeeper brought it up. She read it once, standing, still holding the pen she had been using to work through the Arundel drainage figures she had already committed to memory from their brief correspondence. Then she read it again, more slowly, sitting down. "The matter of the northern fields has progressed beyond the scope of letters. I find I require your presence at Arundel. I am aware this is irregular. I am also aware that irregular problems require irregular solutions, and that you, Miss Hooper, are the only person who has correctly identified the problem in the first place.
I would ask that you come at your earliest convenience, accompanied by a suitable chaperone, for a period of no more than a fortnight. The work is real, the invitation is genuine. The rest I leave to your judgment. E. Hunter, Duke of Arundel. She folded it. She unfolded it. She read the last line again. The rest I leave to your judgment. She was still sitting with it when Madison opened the door without knocking, which was a habit she had never seen reason to correct. She must have seen it on Olivia's face, some involuntary brightness, some failure of the careful neutrality Olivia had spent years perfecting, because Madison stopped in the doorway and her eyes dropped immediately to the letter. What is that? Correspondence. From whom? Olivia considered briefly the pleasure of saying no one of consequence. She set the letter face down on the desk instead. The Duke's steward, regarding the field drainage. Madison's gaze stayed on the letter a half-second too long. She was clever in her way, not with numbers, not with land, but with people, with the precise calibration of what was being hidden and why. She said nothing further. She withdrew. By evening she knew everything. Olivia was never entirely sure how Madison's intelligence network operated, but it functioned with a speed and thoroughness that would have impressed Mrs. Hooper's imaginary general considerably. The dinner table that night had the atmosphere of a court-martial. "He has invited you," Madison said, setting down her fork with a care that suggested she would have preferred to throw it, "to his estate." "For a business consultation," Olivia said, "on the harvest failures. There is no such thing as a business consultation that requires a fortnight. There is when the problem is a failed drainage system affecting 400 acres and the livelihoods of 60 tenant families." The silence that followed this was the particular silence of a room in which one person has accidentally revealed how much they know and everyone else is recalibrating. Mrs. Hooper, at the head of the table, had not spoken. She was doing the thing she did, assembling, calculating, finding the angle. When she finally set down her own cutlery, it was with the deliberate quiet of a decision being made. "You will go," she said. Madison's head turned sharply. "Mother!" "You will go," Mrs. Hooper repeated, looking only at Olivia, "and you will take your cousin Agnes as chaperone, which is respectable enough for no one to refuse and pliable enough for our purposes." A pause. "And you will remember our conversation of this morning." Olivia held her mother's gaze. "I remember it perfectly." "Good." Madison pushed back from the table and left the room, not slamming the door, she was too controlled for that, but closing it with a firmness that said everything a slam would have. Later, alone in the north-facing study, Olivia reread the Duke's letter by candlelight. The house had settled into its nighttime silence, that particular hush of a building full of people pretending to sleep. The work is real. The invitation is genuine. She thought of her mother's ledger. She thought of Madison's face at the dinner table, the first time in all her memory that she had seen something close to fear in it. She folded the letter and placed it carefully inside the cover of her estate management notebook, between 2 pages of drainage calculations, where it would be safe, where it would be useful. She began to pack. Arundel did not announce itself the way London did. London was all announcement, the clatter and press of it, the smell of coal smoke and ambition, the sense that every street corner was performing for an audience. Arundel arrived quietly, through a carriage window, as a slow accumulation of green. The hedgerows first, then the long stone walls, then the fields opening out on either side of the road, like pages of a book that had been waiting a long time for the right reader. Olivia had her notebook open before the carriage reached the date-house. Cousin Agnes, who had accepted the role of chaperone with the mild enthusiasm of a woman whose primary requirement of any situation was that it contain adequate seating and regular meals, was asleep against the window, her cap slightly askew. She was, in every sense that mattered, the perfect companion. She asked no difficult questions. She would remember very little. Olivia noted the colour of the soil at the field margins, darker than she'd expected, which suggested clay retention rather than drainage failure, and wrote it down. The Duke met them at the steps of the house, which was itself a small social earthquake. Dukes did not typically appear at their own front doors to receive guests. They sent stewards or butlers, or at minimum a footman of adequate seniority. Elliot Hunter stood at the top of the stone steps in a coat that had clearly seen field work, his dark hair less ordered than it had been in London, and looked, there was no other word for it, relieved. "Miss Hooper," he offered his hand to assist her from the carriage. "You came." "You said the problem was real," she said. "I don't ignore real problems." Something moved briefly across his face, not quite a smile, but the foundation of one. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you do." He gave Agnes his most formal welcome, which Agnes received graciously and immediately converted into a request to be shown to her room, as the roads had been terribly long. A housekeeper materialized, Agnes disappeared, and then it was just the two of them on the steps, with the wide northern sky above and the smell of turned earth coming in from the west fields. "Shall I show you the land?" he asked. "Please," said Olivia, and left her hat inside. They walked the fields for 2 hours. Elliot's land steward, a cautious man named Ferrers, who had managed Arundel for 11 years and clearly considered Olivia's presence a polite catastrophe, trailed behind them at a distance that communicated his objections without requiring him to voice them. She did not mind. She had spent her life being trailed by people whose objections were too large for their courage. She crouched at the edge of the worst affected field and pressed 2 fingers into the soil, then held them up to the light. Behind her, she heard Ferrers draw a breath of professional indignation. "The drainage channels are blocked, but that's not the primary problem. You've been rotating wheat into soil that's been wheat for at least 3 seasons. The land is exhausted. It's not draining poorly because of the channels. The channels are blocked because the root systems have had no variation. There's nothing left to break the clay apart."
A silence. Then Elliot crouched beside her, an action that surprised her, that he would simply do that without ceremony or hesitation, and looked at the soil. "Ferrars told me it was a wet winter." "It was," Olivia said. "The wet winter confirmed it. It didn't cause it." She heard Ferrars make a small sound behind her. She continued. 4-field rotation. This section rests and goes to clover. It fixes the nitrogen, breaks the clay structure, and the sheep can graze it through autumn, which offsets your feed costs through winter. The eastern field has better elevation. That's where your wheat goes next season. The southern plots nearest the stream are your turnip and barley alternation." She stood, brushing the soil from her fingers. "It will take 2 seasons to fully recover, but the first season's improvement will be visible by August." The Duke stood. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize, not condescension, not the faintly surprised approval she received from men who had expected her to know nothing. This was something more level, more considered. "Ferrars," he said, without looking away from her, "please make a note of everything Miss Hooper has just said." Ferrars made the note. The fortnight settled into a pattern that felt to Olivia like the first honest rhythm she had ever lived inside. Mornings in the fields, afternoons at the estate ledgers, which she reorganized with the quiet efficiency of someone dismantling a structure that should never have been built that way. She found 3 redundant supply contracts and 2 tenant rent miscalculations that had been costing the estate money for years. She corrected them without drama, noted them in the margin, and moved on. Evenings were dinner, formal enough for propriety, small enough for conversation. Elliot asked her questions and listened to the full answer, which remained, she found, quietly astonishing. Agnes slept soundly through all of it. The silk dresses Mrs. Hooper had packed hung untouched in the wardrobe.
Olivia wore her plainest cotton day after day and did not miss them once. She was, for the first time in her memory, exactly where she was supposed to be.
The first letter appeared in the Morning Chronicle on a Thursday. Olivia did not see it herself. She was in the East Field at dawn, walking the boundary line with Faraz, who had, over the preceding 10 days, graduated from professional indignation to a guarded, reluctant respect that he expressed primarily through the quality of his note-taking, when the Duke's secretary brought the folded newspaper out across the field with the careful urgency of a man delivering something he wished he were not. Elliot read it first. He read it standing in the thin morning light, and his face did the thing she had come to recognize as his version of anger. Not heat, but a kind of absolute stillness, as though everything inside him had snapped to attention. He handed it to her without comment. She read it. The piece was not signed. It never was in these cases. The Chronicle ran such items beneath the arch anonymity of a correspondent of good standing, which meant anyone with a grievance and a coin could make themselves a journalist for the morning. But the hand behind it, the particular architecture of its cruelty, was as identifiable to Olivia as a signature. It described, in the flowery and technically unprovable language these pieces always employed, a young woman of no particular fortune or standing who had contrived, through a calculated performance of intellectual modesty, to insert herself into the private household of one of England's most eligible dukes. It questioned the nature of consultations conducted without adequate society supervision. It wondered with great performative innocence whether the lady in question possessed a genuine interest in land management, or whether land management was simply the most original trap yet devised for the catching of titled gentlemen. It did not name her. It described her precisely enough that naming was unnecessary. Olivia lowered the paper. The east field stretched out around her, the soil dark and turned, and already, she thought, beginning to breathe again. A wood-pigeon made its low, indifferent sound from the tree line. "There will be more," she said. It was not a question. "Possibly," Elliot said. "There will be more," she repeated, more quietly, because she knew Madison, and Madison did not fire a single shot when a volley would serve better. She was right. The second letter appeared 2 days later, this time in the Illustrated London News, which had a wider readership and a sharper appetite for society commentary. This one was more specific in its inventions. It suggested that the Hooper family finances were considerably less stable than their Mayfair address implied, and proposed, again with that devastating air of innocent inquiry, that the daughter of such a family might find the management of a duke's estate a convenient proximity to a duke's fortune. The third arrived on a Saturday, in a smaller publication, but one read avidly by precisely the segment of society whose opinion functioned as law, the older women, the ones who controlled invitations and decided season by season who was received and who was not. This letter was the most careful and therefore the most dangerous. It did not accuse, it simply asked questions. Had anyone looked closely at the arithmetic of this situation? Was it not curious that a girl of Olivia's unremarkable social history had so suddenly become indispensable to the man of the Duke's standing? Was indispensability not, in certain lights, simply another word for manipulation? Olivia read each one in the north-facing study she had claimed as her working room at the end of each day, while Agnes knitted placidly by the fire and the candles burned low. She read them with the same careful, unemotional attention she applied to the estate accounts, looking not at the words, but at the structure beneath them, the intention behind the phrasing, the precision with which each piece targeted a different audience. It was, she thought, genuinely impressive work. She wished it weren't. On the fourth evening, Elliot knocked at the study door. He carried no newspaper. He sat in the chair opposite her desk, she had begun to think of it, though she would never have said so aloud, and looked at her with that level, considering gaze. "You haven't said anything," he observed.
There is nothing to say that the work doesn't already answer. The work doesn't reach London. Not yet, she said. She set down her pen. I know who is writing them. He was quiet for a moment. So do I. The fire moved in the grate between them. Outside, the Arundel fields lay in their quiet darkness, the eastern section already changed, already beginning its slow recovery, indifferent to everything the London papers said about the woman who had fixed it. Olivia said, "They want you to send me home. They want the scandal loud enough that keeping me here costs you more than losing me does." Elliot looked at her steadily. "And what do you want?" She picked up her pen, looked at the page of drainage calculations, the tenant rent revisions, the yield projections she had spent the last 12 days assembling into something that would outlast any newspaper column ever written. "I want to finish what I started," she said. He stood, moved to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "Then finish it," he said. They arrived on a Wednesday, which was, at Arundel, the worst possible day for an invasion. Wednesday was when Olivia met with the tenant farmers. She had established the practice in her second week, informal gatherings, nothing that required anyone to dress differently or speak carefully, just an open hour in the estate's large kitchen where the men who actually worked the land could tell her what they had observed, and she could tell them what she planned, and they could, together, arrive at something better than either would have managed alone. It was the most productive hour of her week. The farmers had decades of knowledge that no ledger captured. She had frameworks their experience had never been given a chance to meet. The combination, she had found, was quietly extraordinary. She was mid-conversation with an elderly tenant named Grover, who had farmed the southern plots for 40 years and had, 3 days prior, confirmed her turnip rotation theory with a single sentence that made Ferrers go pale with the retrospective cost of not having asked him sooner. When the housekeeper appeared at the kitchen doorway with the expression of a woman delivering news she had not requested. "Ma'am," she said, "there are visitors at the front." Olivia already knew. She did not know how she knew, some older instinct, some body memory of the particular atmospheric pressure that preceded her mother's arrivals, but she set down her pen and looked at Grover and said, "Same time next week," and rose before the housekeeper finished her sentence. They were in the front drawing-room, which the housekeeper had been too well trained to deny them and too sensible to leave them alone in for long. Mrs. Hooper had arranged herself on the best chair, as though she had selected it in advance from a catalogue. She wore travelling clothes that managed, through some alchemy of fabric and bearing, to look like a formal call. Beside her, Madison stood at the window with her back to the room, looking out at the Arundel grounds with the expression of a woman appraising something she intended to acquire. She turned when Olivia entered. "There you are," she said, as though Olivia had been lost. "Here I am," Olivia agreed pleasantly. Mrs. Hooper rose and kissed her cheek with the warmth of a woman who had rehearsed warmth carefully. "We were so concerned, darling. The letters in the papers, quite dreadful, really, though one does wonder how these things begin, and we thought it only right to come and offer support. A family should be together at difficult moments." "It isn't a difficult moment," Olivia said. "The work is going very well." "Yes," Madison said, still at the window. "The work" arrived in quotation marks so clear they were almost audible. Elliot received them at dinner with a courtesy so precisely calibrated it communicated everything it needed to without sacrificing a single point of manners. He was, Olivia observed, excellent at this, the social equivalent of a locked door that was also beautiful to look at. He seated Mrs. Hooper at his right, where she deployed her considerable arsenal of gracious conversation with the efficiency of long practice. He was attentive, warm, and entirely unrevealing. Madison had dressed for dinner in a way that made Agnes blink, and Ferrars, who had joined them, as he sometimes did, find a sudden interest in his soup. The gown was extraordinary. It was also, Olivia thought, watching her sister work the table with practised brilliance, completely correct for the ballrooms of London and slightly wrong for a country dining-room on a Wednesday evening, in the way that a very loud instrument is wrong in a chamber already producing the right sound. She was magnificent. She was also, unmistakably, performing. Elliot was polite. He was not distracted. After dinner, Mrs. Hooper requested a private word with the Duke regarding the family's deep concern for Olivia's well-being and reputation. Elliot granted it with equanimity. Olivia was not invited, which was, of course, entirely the point. She went to the study. She worked for an hour on the yield projections for the northern fields, the most complex section, the one that required the most precise calibration of variables, and did not think about what was being said 2 rooms away. Or rather, she thought about it once, set the thought down like a tool she didn't currently need, and returned to the numbers. The numbers were reliable. They did not scheme. They simply were. Elliot found her there when the house had gone quiet. He said nothing at first. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the way he sometimes did, simply present, not requiring anything from the moment that it wasn't already offering. "She asked me," he said finally, "to release you from your obligations here, for your own protection." Olivia did not look up from the page. "And what did you say?" He crossed to the window and looked out at the dark fields that were already different from the ones she had found 3 weeks ago. "I said," he replied, "that your obligations here are the result of your own competence, and that releasing you from them would be a considerable disservice to the estate." Olivia wrote down a figure, checked it, wrote the next one. "Good," she said. Outside, somewhere in the guest wing, a door closed. The house settled. The fields held their quiet. The work continued. Mrs. Hooper did not leave on Thursday, as Olivia had hoped. She did not leave on Friday, either, which suggested the visit had moved from ambush to occupation. By Saturday morning, she had reorganized the guest wing flowers, redirected 2 of the housemaids, and inserted herself into the estate's social rhythm with the practiced ease of a woman who understood that presence, sustained long enough, became its own kind of authority. Madison, meanwhile, had discovered that Arundel had horses. She rode beautifully. Olivia had always known this, had watched her sister move through the world with that particular physical confidence that made everything she did look like it had been choreographed specifically to be observed. On horseback, she was genuinely arresting. She seemed to understand, instinctively, which path through the grounds would bring her past the windows of the rooms Elliot was most likely to occupy, and at what hour the light would be most flattering. Olivia was in the south field when Madison passed on the grey mare for the second time that morning. She did not look up from the soil sample she was examining. Faraz, beside her, had the decency to pretend he hadn't noticed either. The test, when it came, did not announce itself as one. It arrived in the form of a letter from Lord Ashworth, the chairman of the Royal Agricultural Society, responding to a preliminary report Elliot had submitted, at Olivia's quiet suggestion, documenting the early results of the rotation changes. The letter was enthusiastic. It was also an invitation. Would the Duke of Arundel present his estate's findings at the Society's autumn symposium as a model for other struggling landowners? It was the kind of invitation that did not arrive twice. Elliot read it at breakfast. The full table was present: Mrs. Hooper, Madison, Agnes, Faraz, Olivia. He set the letter down and looked at it for a moment, with an expression Olivia was learning to read, the look of a man doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with numbers. "Congratulations," Mrs. Hooper said, reaching for the marmalade with the serenity of a woman who had heard nothing alarming. "What a tremendous recognition of your stewardship, Your Grace." "The stewardship," Elliot said carefully, "has not been mine." A small silence. "Of course it has," Madison said, with a smile so fluent it was almost convincing. "You had the vision to invite fresh perspectives to the estate. That is leadership." She set down her teacup. "Will you present yourself or send Faraz?" Elliot looked at Olivia. Olivia looked at her plate. He found her in the study an hour later. She had known he would. She had been sitting with her notebook open and her pen still, which was not a thing she did often, but the morning had produced a particular quality of stillness in her that she didn't want to disturb prematurely. "The findings are yours," he said, without preamble. "The estate is yours," replied Olivia. "The invitation is to you. I understand the legal and social architecture of the situation, Miss Hooper," he sat. "I'm asking what you think should happen." She looked at him then. Really looked. The way she had looked at him across the breakfast table on the morning the first poisoned letter arrived, measuring not his title or his manner, but the thing beneath both, the actual person the Duke of Arundel was when no one was performing at him. "If you present it without attribution," she said, "the work will still reach the people who need it. The tenant farmers who are losing harvests they don't understand how to save. That matters more than credit. And if I attribute it correctly, then it becomes a conversation about propriety, whether a woman's analysis of crop rotation is respectable enough to be taken seriously by the Royal Agricultural Society, whether my presence here is—" she paused, "what the newspapers have suggested it is." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, hoofbeats moved across the gravel, Madison returning from her third morning ride. "My mother," Elliot said finally, "has written to me." Olivia stilled. She read the letters in the papers. She is coming to Arundel in a fortnight, before the symposium, to, he chose the word with precision, assess the situation. So there it was, the test beneath the test. Not just London's opinion, not just Madison's campaign, but a mother's judgment, which was in many households the only judgment that carried final authority. "And what does she expect to find?" Olivia asked. "I think," he said, "she expects to find exactly what the letters described." "And what will she find?" He stood, moved to the window. The grey mare was being walked to the stable by a groom, Madison dismounting with her usual elegant precision, glancing up at the house with the practiced casualness of someone always aware of being watched. Elliot turned from the window. "The truth," he said, "which is that my estate is recovering. My accounts are accurate for the first time in 4 years. My tenants attended a voluntary meeting about soil composition and left with something useful. And the person responsible of all of it is sitting in a north-facing study that gets no flattering light, asking for no credit." He looked at her with complete steadiness. "I intend to tell her exactly that." Olivia picked up her pen. She did not trust herself, quite yet, to say anything at all. The Dowager Duchess of Arundel arrived on a Tuesday, which Olivia was beginning to understand was simply the day the universe reserved for its most consequential deliveries. She was smaller than expected. This was the first thing Olivia noticed, that a woman who had occupied such significant space in her imagination for the preceding fortnight should be, in physical fact, a slight figure in excellent grey wool, with sharp, unhurried eyes that moved across a room the way a surveyor's instrument moves across land, measuring everything, committing to nothing prematurely. She greeted her son with genuine warmth. She greeted Mrs. Hooper and Madison with the polished cordiality of a woman who had been managing social situations since before either of them was born. She greeted Olivia last, which was deliberate, and looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, which was also deliberate. "Miss Hooper," she said, "I have read your drainage report." Olivia blinked. "Your Grace?" "Elliot sent it. I found it extremely cogent." She moved past her into the drawing-room. "I should like to discuss the nitrogen figures after dinner." Behind her, Madison's smile did not move, but something behind it did. The week before the Royal Agricultural Exhibition had the compressed, pressurized quality of a room in which too many intentions were trying to occupy the same space. Elliot was in correspondence with Lord Ashworth daily. Ferris was preparing the estate documentation. Olivia was working from dawn until the candles burned down to their stubs, assembling 3 weeks of field observation, tenant consultation, and account revision into a presentation that could be understood not only by agricultural scientists, but by any landowner in England who was losing harvests they didn't know how to save. It was the best work she had ever done. She knew this with the same dispassionate certainty with which she knew a correctly balanced ledger, not pride exactly, but the clean, factual recognition of a thing done properly. She kept the notes in the study, 47 pages, organized by field section, cross-referenced with the tenant observation sheets, the yield comparison tables, the drainage diagrams she had drawn herself in the margins of Ferris's original maps, all of it gone.
Agnes was still asleep. The household was barely stirring. Olivia stood at the desk for 60 seconds, then walked to Madison's room and knocked. No answer. She tried the handle, locked, which in itself was the answer. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor. Madison's carriage was gone from the stable yard. The grey mare's stall was empty. The London road, visible from the upper floor as a pale line cutting through the morning fields, was already occupied by a fast-moving vehicle that was too far away now to stop. Olivia gripped the window-sill once, briefly, then released it. She returned to the study and sat down. Elliot found her there an hour later, which was also becoming a pattern she had not planned for and was not entirely unhappy about. He read her face. He was becoming accurate at this, another thing she had not planned for, and sat without being invited. "What's happened?" She told him, plainly, without embellishment, the way she reported everything, what was missing, when she had last seen it, what she believed had been done with it, and why. He was very still when she finished. "She intends to present it," he said, not a question. "She has 4 days to learn enough of it to be convincing to a non-specialist audience." Olivia looked at the empty desk. "She is not unintelligent. She could manage a surface reading, enough to impress at a distance." "Then we need to—" "No," Olivia said. He stopped. She looked at the desk a moment longer. Then she looked up, and something in her expression had settled, not into defeat, not into the old familiar resignation, but into something altogether different, something that had been building, she realized, across every field walk, every tenant meeting, every corrected ledger, every evening in this north-facing room that got no flattering light. 47 pages. She had written every word. She knew every word. "I don't need the notes," she said. "I wrote them. I know what they say because I know what is true." She reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "Let her take the paper. She cannot take what I know." She began to write. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. Not from memory alone, though memory was what she had, and it proved, to her own quiet astonishment, to be sufficient. She wrote from the deeper place where knowledge lives when it has been earned rather than borrowed. From the mornings in the fields with soil between her fingers, from the afternoons bent over Ferris's historical records, cross-referencing yield against weather, against rotation, from the evenings sitting across from tenant farmers who had handed her 60 years of accumulated observation in the plain language of men who had never been asked to dress their knowledge up. The paper Madison had taken was a record. What Olivia was writing now was the thing the record had been pointing at all along. Agnes woke at 9, found Olivia at the desk, noted the expression on her face, and quietly arranged for breakfast to be brought to the study rather than taken in the dining room. It was, Olivia thought briefly, the most useful thing Agnes had done in 5 weeks, and Agnes had been consistently underestimated by everyone, including herself. By mid-morning, Elliot had stationed himself in the chair across the desk, with the unobtrusive permanence of a man who had decided to be present without requiring the situation to accommodate him.
He read his own correspondence. He asked no questions. When Ferrers arrived with a query about the exhibition transport arrangements, Elliot answered it in the doorway and sent him away without letting the interruption reach the room. Olivia noticed this. She filed it carefully, in the place where she kept things she would examine more thoroughly later, when the present urgency had passed. She kept writing. The Dowager Duchess appeared at 11. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, Olivia at the desk, pages accumulating at her left hand, Elliot across from her with his letters, the general atmosphere of a room in which serious work was being done by people who had agreed, without discussing it, not to waste each other's time. She came in, sat in the third chair by the window, picked up the first completed pages from the stack Olivia had set aside, and began to read. No one said anything. The fire moved. A pen scratched. Pages turned. After 20 minutes, the Dowager Duchess set the pages down and looked at Olivia with those surveyor's eyes. "You've changed the nitrogen argument from the drainage report," she said. "You've strengthened it." "The drainage report was written in my second week. I knew more in week 2 than week 1. I know more now than week 2. The Dowager was quiet for another moment. "The tenant observations in section 4. Old Grover's family has farmed that plot since my husband's father's time. Did he confirm the clay composition theory?" With one sentence, in about 40 years fewer words than I needed. Something moved in the Dowager's face, the foundation, Olivia thought, of the same almost smile she recognized in Elliot. "He always did," she said, and returned to reading. By afternoon, Olivia had reconstructed 41 of the 47 pages. The remaining 6 were the drainage diagrams, visual work that could not be entirely reproduced in words and would need to be redrawn, which required the original field measurements she had committed, she discovered with relief, to a separate notebook that Madison had not found or not thought worth taking. She set her pen down, flexed her fingers, looked at the stack of pages. They were different from the originals. She understood this without distress. They were better, sharper, more direct, stripped of the careful qualifications she had written in the early weeks when she was still not entirely certain of her own conclusions. 5 weeks of Arundel had burned the hesitation out of them. Madison had stolen a draft. What remained was the final argument. Elliot looked up when she set the pen down and met her eyes across the desk. "Done?" he asked. "The written portion," she squared the pages. "I need to redraw the drainage diagrams tomorrow, and I should speak with Ferrers about the exhibition display boards. I'll arrange it." He paused. "And Madison?" Olivia considered the question with the same dispassionate attention she gave to everything. Madison would arrive at the exhibition with 47 pages of notes in Olivia's handwriting. She would have had 4 days to study them. She was intelligent and she was practiced, and she would have prepared something that would, at a distance, be plausible. But the Royal Agricultural Society's Autumn Symposium was not an audience that observed at a distance. It was scientists and landowners, and men who had spent their lives in fields and counted rooms, and knew the difference immediately and instinctively between a person who understood something and a person who had memorized it. "She can have the notes," Olivia said. "She cannot have the 5 weeks." She stood, straightened her plain cotton dress, and moved to the window. The Arundel fields lay in the low afternoon light, the eastern section visibly different now from the surrounding land, darker, more structured, already demonstrating the argument she had made about it in 41 pages of reconstructed truth. The land itself was her evidence. It had been there all along. She turned back to the room. "I'm ready," she said. The Royal Agricultural Exhibition occupied the Great Hall of Burlington House on a Friday morning in October, which meant that London, the full, assembled, opinion-aged machinery of it, was present and paying attention. The ton did not typically attend agricultural symposiums, but word had travelled, as word in London always did, through the precise and efficient network of morning rooms and club anterooms and carriage conversations, that the Duke of Arundel would be presenting findings from his estate, that the findings were remarkable, that the circumstances surrounding them were, depending on which version of events one had received, either scandalous or extraordinary, or, most intriguingly, both. Burlington House was full. Olivia arrived with Elliot and the Dowager Duchess, which was itself a statement so clear it required no translation. The Dowager had made the decision that morning over breakfast, without consulting anyone, announcing simply that she would ride with Miss Hooper and that Ferrers should ensure the display boards were positioned to catch the north light, which was most accurate for the color differentiation in the soil diagrams. Madison was already there. Olivia saw her from across the entrance hall, copper hair precise, gown immaculate, positioned near the presentation area with the studied casualness of someone who had arrived early enough to claim the territory. She held a sheaf of papers with her left hand, the gesture of a person demonstrating for any observer that she was in possession of documentation. Their eyes met across the hall. Madison's chin lifted in precise degree. Olivia looked away first, not in retreat, but in the manner of a person who has assessed a situation and found it less significant than the work ahead. The morning proceeded through 3 preliminary presentations: a Suffolk landowner on drainage machinery, a Scottish agronomist on seed selection, a Lincolnshire farmer whose findings on winter barley were sound, if not surprising. The hall listened with the polite attention of an audience waiting for the thing they had actually come to see. Then Lord Ashworth rose and introduced the Duke of Arundel. Elliot stood at the podium with the composed authority of a man entirely comfortable with the room's attention, and said, with no preamble, "The recovery of Arundel's northern estates is not my achievement. I invited the achievement. The work was done by Miss Olivia Hooper, and she will present it." The hall produced a sound that was not quite silence and not quite noise, the specific acoustic of 400 people revising their understanding of a situation simultaneously. Olivia walked to the podium. She had prepared for nerves. She had a strategy for nerves, the same strategy she applied to any unruly variable: acknowledge it, account for it, work around it. But standing at the podium with Burlington House arranged before her, she discovered that what she felt was not nerves at all. It was clarity.
She began with the soil, not with the theory, not with the methodology, but with the specific fact of clay composition in the eastern field on the morning she first pressed 2 fingers into the earth and understood what she was looking at. She spoke plainly and precisely, the way she wrote, without decoration or apology. And she felt the room, the farmers in the back rows especially, the men with field knowledge in their hands, begin to lean forward. She spoke for 35 minutes. At some point, she became aware that Madison had moved. She caught the motion at the edge of her vision, a copper-haired figure drifting by degrees away from the presentation area, the sheaf of papers lowered, then absent, drifting toward the side of the hall, then toward the gallery stairs, retreating step by careful step to where the light didn't reach. Olivia did not watch her go. She had 4 more minutes of findings to present, and they were the best 4 minutes, and they deserved her full attention. She gave them that. The applause, when it came, was not the polite percussion of social obligation. It began in the back rows, the farmers, the land agents, the men who recognized in it something they could use, and moved forward through the hall like a change in weather. Lord Ashworth said something to the Duke. The Duke nodded once. Then Elliot crossed the floor to the podium, and the hall, reading the movement with the collective literacy of an audience that had been attending social performances its entire life, went very quiet. He did not kneel. This was Burlington House, not a drawing-room, and he was not a man who performed gestures he did not mean. He stood beside her and spoke at a volume the first 3 rows could hear, which was sufficient because the first 3 rows would ensure the rest of London heard it by nightfall.
I have a question for you that has nothing to do with soil composition, he said. Olivia looked at him. She had spent 5 weeks learning to read his face, and what she read there now was the same thing she had seen on the Arundel steps the morning she arrived: relief and certainty, and the expression of a man who had found what he had not known he was looking for. Yes, she said, before he finished asking. The hall exhaled. Somewhere above them, in the gallery where the light did not reach, a figure in a copper-haired silhouette stood alone among the shadows, finally, and for the first time in her life, entirely, irrevocably, second. Olivia did not look up. She had stopped looking backward 3 chapters ago.
And so, Olivia Hooper, who had spent a lifetime being told to make herself smaller, stood at the center of the largest room in London and took up exactly the space she had always deserved. She did not do it loudly. She did not do it dramatically. She did it the way she did everything, with precision, with preparation, and with the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who had stopped asking permission. That is where we leave her. Not waiting, not apologizing, not watching from the edges while someone else holds the light. First, in every sense of the word. Dear listeners, thank you. Not in the way of a formality, but genuinely from the people who sat with this story long enough to believe in it. You chose to spend your time with Olivia and Elliot, with the breakfast room battlefield and the stolen notes and the soil of Arundel and the 35 minutes at Burlington House that changed everything. That is not a small thing. Time is the only currency that cannot be recovered, and you gave yours to this story. We are honored. If Olivia's journey, from invisibility to recognition, from erasure to empowerment, from second to undeniably, irrevocably first, if any part of that moved something in you, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe so the next story finds you the moment it arrives. Leave us a comment and tell us what stayed with you. Your thoughts genuinely shape how we tell these tales, and every insight you share makes this community richer. A like, if you enjoyed watching Olivia step out of the shadows, tells us that stories like hers deserve to be told louder and longer. And turn on your notifications, because our next story is already waiting, and it belongs to someone just as quietly extraordinary. Your support is not just a number to us, it is the reason we keep the candle lit. Until next time, may you always have the courage to be seen for exactly who you are. May you find someone who recognizes the difference between a performance and a truth. And may you, like Olivia, discover that the most powerful thing you possess has been yours all along. It was never the room that needed to change. It was only ever the moment you decided to speak. We'll see you in the next story. Don't be late. The best seat is always saved for those who show up.